DJ Screw ruled as the undisputed king of Houston hip-hop, but his legendary chopped and screwed empire was secretly fueled by a fatal addiction to lean. While the culture romanticized prescription codeine as a status symbol, Screw was using the heavy opioid simply to survive crushing studio pressure. The scene enabled his lethal dependency right up until his body collapsed. The exact chemical depressant that slowed his music down eventually stopped his heart, leaving him dead on his studio floor at 29. DJ Screw was born into a reality defined not by chemical escapism, but by a pure, consuming, and highly mechanical obsession with the physical properties of vinyl records. Long before he became the global symbol for a sluggish, heavily medicated lifestyle, he was a hyper-focused, incredibly precise technician operating entirely behind the turntables. His initial interaction with music was deeply tactile and intensely demanding. He viewed the record player not simply as a passive playback device, but as a complex physical instrument waiting to be aggressively conquered. He possessed a terrifyingly acute acoustic sensitivity, an innate biological metronome that allowed him to execute flawless, highly complex audio mixes, completely without the standard industry requirement of studio headphones. He did not need to isolate the audio in his ears. He could literally feel the physical groove of the vinyl under his fingertips and dictate the precise movement of the crossfader through a profound muscular intuition. He possessed a raw, undeniable mastery over the physical equipment, treating the turntable as a direct extension of his own central nervous system. The name Screw originated directly from his manipulation of the hardware. Friends gave him the nickname because he would constantly screw up the records by pulling down the pitch fader. Instead of defacing the vinyl physically, he artificially dragged the tempo down into a heavy, suffocating crawl. Yet from this precise, localized moment of aggressive destruction, a completely unprecedented, highly mathematical sonic order was born. He began forcefully manipulating the heavy motorized platters of his turntables, artificially dragging the tempo of high-energy hip-hop tracks down into a heavy, suffocating crawl. He specifically targeted a tempo ranging between 60 and 70 beats per minute. This was not a random audio calculation. This specific frequency precisely mirrors the biological resting heart rate of a human being locked in a state of deep restorative sleep. By applying this immense physical friction to the vinyl, he completely annihilated the frantic, hyperkinetic energy of traditional rap music, forcing the entire acoustic environment to collapse inward and creating a dense, heavy, and inescapable wall of sound. This mechanical manipulation produced a terrifyingly effective result. By dragging the audio down to this physiological baseline, he entirely stripped away the superficial, fast-paced distractions of the music. He forced his audience to process every single drawn-out syllable of the vocal track with an intense, unavoidable clarity. Words that were previously rushed past at standard speeds were suddenly transformed into heavy, echoing declarations of street survival and regional dominance. The bass lines, originally designed to be sharp and punchy, were stretched out into massive low-frequency shock waves that physically rattled the internal organs of anyone sitting inside a vehicle equipped with heavy subwoofers. He did not just change the speed of the song, he fundamentally altered the physical experience of the listener. He created a sonic environment that demanded total physical submission. The technique, which he officially dubbed chopped and screwed, involved not only slowing the tempo but rhythmically repeating, aggressively scratching, and entirely restructuring the vocal patterns. He took the established rules of audio engineering, shattered them completely, and built an entirely new sonic kingdom from the resulting fragments, forcing the entire globe to adapt to his specific, heavily calculated frequency. Within the highly competitive, frequently dangerous, and heavily insulated underground economy of Houston, Texas, this unprecedented audio innovation elevated Robert to the status of an untouchable, fiercely protected cultural deity. He utilized his rapidly expanding influence not to secure a lucrative, isolated corporate contract with a major label in New York or Los Angeles, but to construct a massive, highly organized local collective known as the Screwed Up Clique. He operated precisely like a benevolent, heavily respected syndicate boss, but his currency was audio tape rather than violence. He actively pulled young, disenfranchised men directly from the unforgiving, impoverished streets of the South Side neighborhoods and handed them a microphone in his personal studio. He transformed local hustlers, neighborhood friends, and entirely unknown voices into massive, highly lucrative regional legends. He provided the crucial, undeniable platform for raw, unpolished talents like Fat Pat, Big Mo, ESG, Lil Kiki, and a towering, deep-voiced young man from the Third Ward who recorded under the name Big Floyd, globally known decades later as George Floyd. For these men, Robert was not just a producer, he was the absolute architect of their financial survival and their public dignity. He assumed the role of the ultimate older brother, characterized by an absolute, unwavering willingness to provide financial support, creative guidance, and physical shelter to anyone who earned a place within his trusted circle. The economic engine he built was entirely self-sustained and incredibly lucrative. He bypassed the entire corporate music distribution system, choosing instead to sell his highly customized, personalized cassette tapes directly out of the front door of his own home. The demand was so overwhelming, so absolute, that it generated a staggering influx of physical cash on a daily basis. He possessed the liquid capital to purchase the extravagant, highly visible trappings of standard rap stardom, including massive mansions and heavily customized foreign vehicles. Yet he completely rejected this shallow exterior. He lived a remarkably modest, heavily insulated existence, choosing to reinvest his massive cash reserves back into his studio equipment and the people immediately surrounding him. His quiet, unyielding generosity and his absolute refusal to abandon his neighborhood earned him a level of profound, localized respect that completely transcended the standard boundaries of the entertainment industry. He became the ultimate hometown hero, an immovable pillar of the community whose very physical presence in Houston represented the undeniable beating heart of independent Southern pride, establishing a heavy, comforting facade that completely shielded the deeply exhausting, physically destructive reality operating just out of public sight. However, the absolute unyielding autonomy that Robert Earl Davis Jr. so fiercely protected came with a physiological and psychological price tag that no human biology could sustainably afford. The public saw the benevolent Godfather dispensing wisdom and wealth from his porch, but they were entirely blind to the grueling industrialized reality operating just on the other side of his front door. Rejecting the massive exploitative contracts from corporate record labels in New York and Los Angeles meant that Robert retained 100% of his creative freedom and his financial profits, but it also meant he absorbed 100% of the labor. He was not simply an artist, he was the entire supply chain. He was the executive producer, the recording engineer, the physical manufacturer, the marketing department, and the primary retail distributor. He operated a massive, highly lucrative independent music empire entirely from the confines of his own living room. The demand for his signature gray cassette tapes was not merely high. It was a rabid, insatiable cultural hunger. On any given night, the residential street outside his home would transform into a chaotic, heavily congested parking lot. A massive line of custom-painted vehicles, vibrating with the low-frequency bass of his previous recordings, would stretch far down the block, filled with hundreds of desperate fans and neighborhood residents waiting for hours just to hand physical cash through an iron security gate in exchange for a plastic cassette. This staggering, unrelenting demand placed a crushing, incomprehensible weight upon his shoulders. He was not manufacturing a mass-produced identical product. The profound brilliance and the ultimate curse of a DJ Screw mixtape was its deep personalization. Every single tape was a unique, meticulously crafted audio document. Fans would literally pay him to incorporate highly specific personal shout-outs into the audio, requesting that he mention their names, their neighborhoods, their incarcerated friends, and their local street corners over the slowed-down instrumentals. He was essentially carving personalized sonic monuments for thousands of individual people in real time. To fulfill this towering mountain of customized orders, Robert became a radical, extreme workaholic, pushing his physical body far past the absolute limits of human endurance. He would physically lock himself inside the windowless confines of his home studio, widely known as the Screw Room, for astonishing stretches of time. He routinely executed grueling, uninterrupted recording sessions lasting 12, 18, or sometimes 24 consecutive hours. He stood hunched over the heavy turntables and the mixing boards, his hands constantly, frantically moving, physically manipulating the vinyl, adjusting the pitch controls, and operating the microphone, entirely cut off from natural sunlight, normal social interaction, and the basic biological necessity of sleep. The severe compounding physical exhaustion and the immense psychological pressure of maintaining this independent empire rapidly depleted his natural biological reserves. The human central nervous system is fundamentally not designed to sustain this level of relentless, high-stakes mechanical output without experiencing catastrophic failure. Robert found himself trapped in a devastating, suffocating paradox. The more successful his independent business became, the more physical labor it required, and the less time he had to actually rest and recover. To forcefully combat the crushing weight of his own physical exhaustion, to artificially pry his eyes open during those endless dark hours in the studio, and to numb the aching pain in his joints from standing over the equipment, he began to actively seek out a synthetic, chemical stamina. He did not turn to traditional high-energy stimulants to stay awake. In a deeply tragic, deeply ironic biological calculation, he turned to a powerful central nervous system depressant. He began to heavily, systematically abuse prescription-grade cough syrup, a highly potent mixture of codeine and promethazine, violently cutting the thick medicinal liquid with sweet soda and hard fruit candy to mask the chemical taste. It is absolutely crucial to understand the exact timeline of this chemical subjugation to accurately assess his legacy. The revolutionary, paradigm-shifting technique of slowing down the music, the chopped and screwed aesthetic, was completely invented and perfected by Robert long before he ever picked up a styrofoam cup of syrup. The genius was entirely his own. It was not born from a narcotic haze. However, as the crushing pressure of his localized fame intensified, the codeine and promethazine rapidly mutated from a casual, occasional indulgence into a strict, non-negotiable, and heavily mandated weapon of mass production. He utilized the purple liquid as a crude, highly dangerous tool to manipulate his own internal clock. The codeine, a powerful opioid, aggressively suppressed his physical pain and the screaming biological signals of extreme sleep deprivation. The promethazine, a strong sedative and antihistamine, induced a heavy floating state of deep dissociation. Together, this toxic chemical cocktail placed him in a bizarre twilight state of consciousness, a waking coma where his body was heavily anesthetized, yet his mind remained hyper-focused exclusively on the movement of the vinyl records. He essentially utilized the narcotic to induce a state of artificial, localized paralysis, numbing everything in his physical reality except for the precise mechanical connection between his fingertips and the audio faders. The synchronization between the narcotic coursing through his vascular system and the acoustic environment he was engineering was absolute and terrifying. To match the crawling 60 beats per minute tempo of his turntables, Screw chemically forced his own heart to do the same. The prescription syrup and the machinery formed a single, closed-loop system. He would consume the purple liquid continuously throughout the grueling recording sessions, utilizing the chemical numbness to endure the physical torment of the isolation. The drug provided a false, deeply deceptive sense of boundless endurance, allowing him to endlessly chop, scratch, and seamlessly blend tracks, while completely ignoring the severe, compounding damage he was inflicting upon his liver, his kidneys, and his respiratory system. He was literally converting his own cellular health, his own finite biological lifespan, into the raw, consumable energy required to manufacture the thousands of cassette tapes demanded by the streets of Houston. The most agonizing, quietly devastating consequence of this relentless production cycle was the complete total erosion of the man himself. As the volume of his musical output exploded, saturating car stereos across the entire state of Texas and generating immense localized wealth, the physical presence of Robert Earl Davis Jr. actively began to vanish. The generous, highly visible neighborhood patriarch who used to organize massive community barbecues and hold court on his front porch slowly mutated into a heavily medicated, deeply isolated recluse. He became a ghost, haunting his own house. The severe chemical dependency and the obsessive pathological need to remain in front of the turntables severed his physical connection to the outside world. He stopped leaving the property. He stopped engaging in standard face-to-face human conversations. He entirely retreated into the dark, heavily air-conditioned sanctuary of the screw room, choosing to communicate with his friends, his family, and his massive audience almost exclusively through the heavily distorted, slurred vocal shout-outs recorded onto the magnetic tape of his cassettes. This is the profound, deeply bitter tragedy sitting at the very center of his independent empire. He was an undeniable historic musical genius, a man who possessed the raw intelligence and the unyielding willpower to look directly at the massive predatory corporate music industry, entirely reject their exploitative contracts, and successfully build a self-sustaining, highly lucrative kingdom on his own exact terms. He fought a brutal, brilliant war to maintain his absolute creative and financial freedom. Yet, in the silent, suffocating darkness of his own recording studio, he willingly, systematically handed over the physical autonomy of his own biological body to a styrofoam cup filled with a highly addictive, lethal chemical liquid. He had successfully conquered the music business, but he had entirely enslaved himself to the purple syrup, trading the iron shackles of a record label for the soft, heavy, and ultimately fatal chains of an opioid addiction. The severe, compounding physical toll of this lifestyle was not merely a gradual decline. It was a visible, active deterioration of a man operating at the absolute limits of human endurance. As the demand for his customized tapes reached a fever pitch, Robert's physical appearance drastically altered. The once vibrant, highly visible community figure began to carry significant, unhealthy weight, a direct metabolic consequence of severe sleep deprivation combined with the massive caloric intake of sugary sodas used to dilute the heavy narcotic. His eyes, heavily hooded and constantly fighting the overwhelming sedative effects of the promethazine, became a permanent fixture of his weary expression. He was trapped in a grueling, localized form of solitary confinement, while the entire city of Houston was loudly celebrating his genius, cruising down the sunlit highways to the heavy, dragging tempo he created. The architect of their joy was entombed in a freezing, windowless room, severely dehydrated, fighting off physical tremors and artificially forcing his nervous system to stay awake just to fulfill the next order. He had built a massive, lucrative kingdom, but he was actively paying the rent with his own vital organs. The profound systemic hypocrisy of the American narcotics trade and its subsequent cultural consumption reached an absolute, terrifying zenith within the specific geographical boundaries of Houston during the 1990s. The unchecked, lethal escalation of his chemical dependency was actively insulated, funded, and enthusiastically celebrated by a deeply warped sociological landscape. During an era when the mainstream media and federal law enforcement agencies were aggressively militarizing the streets to combat the devastating crack cocaine epidemic, heavily stigmatizing its users as desperate, frantic casualties of urban decay, an entirely different, highly insidious chemical culture was quietly taking absolute control of the Texas underground. This new narcotic did not arrive in the form of a heavily criminalized, highly volatile white rock sold in dark alleyways. It arrived in a pristine, sealed, and FDA-approved pharmaceutical bottle. The mixture of prescription-strength codeine and promethazine cough syrup, legally manufactured by massive corporate entities and readily dispensed by licensed medical professionals, was completely stripped of the traditional devastating stigma attached to hard street drugs. Within the highly insular, fiercely proud hip-hop community of the South, this thick purple liquid was aggressively rebranded and widely embraced not as a dangerous, life-threatening opioid, but as the ultimate, highly sophisticated player potion. It was instantly elevated to the status of a premium luxury item, a heavily guarded cultural secret that directly symbolized elevated social status, immense disposable income, and a refined, heavily curated lifestyle of supreme relaxation. The daily consumption of this pharmaceutical cocktail evolved into a rigid, highly aestheticized cultural ritual. It was not consumed in secret or hidden from public view. It was proudly, visibly displayed in double-stacked white styrofoam cups, meticulously diluted with specific brands of clear citrus soda, and frequently sweetened with hard fruit candies, dropped directly into the mixture to mask the bitter, medicinal chemical taste. Holding that styrofoam cup became the absolute equivalent of holding a flute of vintage, highly expensive champagne in the VIP section of a nightclub. It projected a specific, heavily desired aura of untouchable cool, a slow-moving, heavily insulated confidence that stood in direct, aggressive defiance of the fast-paced, highly stressed reality of daily survival in the impoverished neighborhoods of the city. The incredibly dangerous underlying clinical reality was completely ignored by the consumer base. Codeine is a highly addictive, heavily regulated narcotic that belongs to the exact same biological family as heroin and morphine. It is a massive central nervous system depressant designed to directly bind to the opioid receptors in the human brain, actively suppressing the respiratory system and drastically lowering the heart rate. Promethazine, the secondary active ingredient, is a powerful first-generation antihistamine and severe neuroleptic sedative that aggressively compounds the lethargic, heavily intoxicating effects of the opioid. When combined in massive, unregulated recreational doses, these two chemicals create a profound, overwhelming state of physical paralysis and deep psychological dissociation, pulling the user into a heavy, suffocating chemical undertow that permanently alters their brain chemistry. The medical establishment and the pharmaceutical distribution networks of the 1990s operated with a terrifying, almost criminal level of willful ignorance regarding the explosive recreational abuse of their highly addictive products. Long before the devastating realities of the modern national opioid crisis forced a massive, aggressive federal crackdown on prescription protocols, the state of Texas functioned as a highly porous, easily manipulated environment for narcotic acquisition. Unscrupulous physicians operating out of localized pain clinics, entirely apathetic pharmacists, and easily bypassed regulatory loopholes created an environment where massive wholesale quantities of the highly lethal purple syrup were diverted directly from the legitimate medical supply chain and pumped aggressively into the streets of Houston. The highly regulated chemical poison was incredibly easy to access, heavily subsidized by the legitimate pharmaceutical industry, and completely normalized by a medical system that actively looked the other way while an entire generation of young men slowly, systematically sedated themselves into early graves. The relentless daily congestion of vehicles outside his residence inevitably triggered aggressive scrutiny from local law enforcement. Heavily armed narcotics officers, observing the massive influx of physical cash, became convinced he was operating a high-level illicit cartel. When tactical units eventually raided the property to hunt for illegal street drugs, they completely overlooked the actual lethal threat in the room. They walked directly past the massive stockpiles of sealed, prescription-grade cough syrup sitting on his mixing console, legally dismissing the bottles as standard medical supplies. The state mobilized armed units to police minor infractions, while the legal system protected the exact mass-produced pharmaceutical poison that was methodically shutting down his respiratory system. The absolute most tragic and deeply devastating catalyst for the massive, explosive national popularization of this localized chemical culture was the very music Robert Earl Davis Jr. was obsessively engineering inside his bedroom. His revolutionary, painstakingly crafted mixtapes, completely devoid of standard corporate marketing or traditional radio distribution, became the ultimate, highly effective broadcasting mechanism for the purple liquid. His highly customized, heavily altered audio tracks did not merely mention the drug, they completely absorbed its chemical properties, perfectly mimicking the exact heavy physiological sensation of the opioid high. The entire sonic architecture of his chopped and screwed technique was specifically heavily engineered to perfectly synchronize with a central nervous system actively failing under the crushing weight of massive doses of codeine. When he forcefully dragged the tempo of the music down to that crawling, heavily distorted 60 beats per minute, he was not just making a creative, artistic choice. He was actively projecting his own severe internal biological reality outward through the massive subwoofers of the city. He was forcing the entire audio environment to operate at the exact same depressed, heavily sedated frequency as his own chemically altered heart rate. The consumer base, consisting of hundreds of thousands of fiercely dedicated fans, eagerly embraced this entirely unprecedented heavy acoustic experience. They purchased the highly coveted gray cassette tapes, slid them directly into the heavily modified audio systems of their customized candy-painted vehicles, poured massive quantities of the purple syrup into their styrofoam cups, and drove incredibly slowly down the vast, sprawling highways of Texas. They treated his music as the ultimate defining soundtrack to their chemical euphoria, a heavy hypnotic form of urban stoner rock that provided an absolute impenetrable acoustic shield against the harsh realities of the outside world. The consumers were entirely, blissfully mesmerized by the deep, heavy, and incredibly sluggish audio environment he had constructed. They nodded their heads to the heavily manipulated, drawn-out vocal tracks, entirely oblivious to the terrifying, unvarnished clinical truth of the product they were consuming. They completely failed to recognize that the sluggish, highly celebrated tempo they were heavily addicted to was the exact literal acoustic reflection of a human respiratory system actively struggling to draw oxygen into its lungs. This massive, deeply concerning cognitive disconnect between the euphoric, highly entertained consumer and the rapidly deteriorating, heavily isolated creator exposes the absolute chilling apathy of the commercial music machine, even when that machine operates entirely outside the traditional corporate boundaries. Robert Earl Davis Jr. was completely surrounded by a massive, fiercely loyal community that worshipped his every audio manipulation, yet he was fundamentally, absolutely alone in his suffering. The people who claimed to love him the most, the individuals who proudly wore the merchandise and loudly claimed membership in his extensive cultural movement, were the exact same people actively, relentlessly demanding the continuous, unbroken production of the very audio tapes that were methodically destroying his biological existence. They completely ignored the severe, glaring physical symptoms of his chronic, escalating opioid addiction. They looked directly past the rapid, unhealthy physical weight gain, the extreme severe lethargy, the heavily slurred speech, and the deeply concerning periods of physical absence, choosing instead to focus entirely on the release date of the next highly anticipated personalized mixtape. The most heartbreaking, deeply agonizing element of this relentless, localized consumption was the absolute purity of his initial motivations. He was not engaging in this brutal, highly destructive, and entirely unregulated manufacturing process for the pursuit of extreme corporate wealth. He had already achieved a level of absolute, massive financial independence that completely bypassed the traditional predatory structures of the music industry. His private residence was heavily guarded, containing literal garbage bags, overflowing with hundreds of thousands of dollars in physical, untraceable cash, generated entirely from hand-to-hand transactions. He possessed the immediate liquid capital required to completely abandon the grueling, exhausting, and heavily toxic daily grind of the mixtape assembly line. He could have easily purchased a massive, isolated estate, hired a team of professional engineers to handle the technical execution, and retired comfortably into a life of secure, heavily insulated luxury. Yet, he completely rejected this logical exit strategy. He remained entirely trapped inside his claustrophobic, heavily chemical-scented home studio, permanently anchored to his turntables and his mixing console by a profound, inescapable sense of duty. He was absolutely crushed by the overwhelming, invisible weight of his own massive, heavily protected hometown hero status. He possessed a deeply ingrained, almost pathological need to continuously provide for his community, to ensure that every single highly customized shout-out was recorded perfectly, and to guarantee that the streets of Houston always had access to his specific, heavily engineered audio frequency. The massive, intimidating line of customized vehicles constantly idling outside his front door, stretching far down the residential block in the oppressive, suffocating heat of the Texas summer, acted as the ultimate, entirely unintentional warden of his heavily medicated prison. The fans waiting outside in their cars did not view themselves as demanding consumers. They viewed themselves as his family, his loyal subjects waiting patiently for a personalized audience with their king. But their absolute, unyielding love for his audio product was a heavy, suffocating demand that he simply could not ignore. To stop recording, to turn off the turntables, and to lock the front door of his house to seek genuine, intensive medical rehabilitation would mean fundamentally betraying the absolute trust of the very community that had elevated him to the status of a living god. He believed, with a tragic, fatalistic dedication, that his primary biological purpose was to supply the music, regardless of the immense escalating physical cost to his own cellular structure. He willingly traded the fundamental, basic health of his internal organs for the continued cultural dominance of his localized empire. While he sat heavily slumped in his studio chair, completely exhausted, desperately forcing his eyes open, and pouring another massive lethal dose of the purple liquid into his cup, simply to shock his severely depleted nervous system back into a state of artificial, highly dangerous productivity. The crowd outside simply turned up the volume on their car stereos and impatiently waited for the next tape to be passed through the security gate. They were entirely, willfully blind to the absolute horror of the situation. They were eagerly, enthusiastically consuming the active, real-time destruction of a profound musical genius, utilizing his slow, methodical suicide as the primary, heavily celebrated background music for their own chemically altered recreation. The massive, historic, cultural movement he built completely swallowed him whole, demanding that he continuously feed the machinery with his own life force, until there was absolutely nothing left inside the studio but empty styrofoam cups, heavily worn vinyl records, and the deafening, entirely unresolved silence of a physical body that had been entirely, ruthlessly exhausted by the crushing, unrelenting expectations of the crowd. The human biological system possesses a terrifyingly precise, highly aggressive internal alarm mechanism, explicitly designed to signal impending catastrophic failure. Yet Robert Earl Davis Jr. was entirely trapped within a localized cultural ecosystem that actively normalized the total dismissal of these critical medical alerts. In the weeks and months immediately preceding the stark, chilling autumn of the year 2000, the massive, highly toxic, and completely unregulated quantities of prescription promethazine and codeine permanently saturating his cellular structure began to trigger severe, undeniable neurological misfires. He did not simply experience standard physical exhaustion or the routine lethargy associated with prolonged studio sessions. His heavily medicated central nervous system began to aggressively, violently short-circuit. Individuals granted access to the highly insulated inner circle of his private residence bore witness to deeply disturbing medical emergencies. The undisputed, highly revered godfather of Houston hip-hop was observed suffering from terrifying full-body physical seizures, his muscular structure convulsing uncontrollably as his brain struggled to process the overwhelming, toxic chemical load. In any rational, medically informed environment, a severe drug-induced neurological seizure mandates an immediate, non-negotiable emergency hospitalization, a total physiological detox, and a complete cessation of the chemical intake. However, within the dark, heavily insulated, and deeply compromised walls of his recording facility, these horrifying biological red flags were tragically misinterpreted. The intense pressure to maintain his independent manufacturing empire, combined with the severe blinding nature of his opioid addiction, created a fatal psychological barrier. The seizures were treated not as the imminent glaring precursors to sudden cardiac arrest, but merely as temporary unfortunate occupational hazards associated with the sluggish, highly medicated lifestyle he had popularized. He simply waited for the violent tremors to subside, wiped his face, turned the heavy studio equipment back on, and poured another measured dose of the purple liquid to forcefully stabilize his violently shaking hands, completely oblivious to the fact that his internal organs were actively initiating a permanent, irreversible shutdown sequence. The inevitable, devastating climax of this relentless biological punishment arrived with a terrifying, absolute lack of cinematic grandeur or public spectacle. There was no dramatic, highly publicized confrontation, no chaotic rush to a crowded emergency room, and absolutely no final, profound declarations delivered to his massive, fiercely loyal audience. The 16th of November 2000 began as just another heavily medicated, deeply isolated day inside the private recording studio that had served as both the engine of his massive wealth and the literal architecture of his physical prison. The man who had meticulously, obsessively engineered the heavy, defining soundtrack for an entire generation of Southern youth simply stepped away from his mixing console, walked into the private bathroom of his studio, and completely collapsed onto the cold, unforgiving floor. The massive, lethal combination of central nervous system depressants finally achieved total, unyielding dominance over his respiratory drive. His brain, entirely suffocated by the heavy chemical blanket of the narcotics, simply ceased sending the fundamental biological command to his lungs to draw oxygen. He suffocated in absolute, complete silence. When his motionless, entirely unresponsive body was finally discovered by his associates, the stark, horrifying reality of the scene instantly shattered the invincible, heavily protected mythology of DJ Screw. He was only 29 years old, the man who possessed the supernatural ability to manipulate the tempo of any audio track, forcefully bending time and rhythm to his absolute will, had tragically, permanently run out of time entirely. The bustling, highly active residential street outside his home, usually gridlocked with heavily customized vehicles waiting to purchase his legendary cassettes, was abruptly filled with the flashing urgent lights of emergency medical services and local law enforcement, officially signaling the sudden violent end of an unprecedented independent musical empire. The initial shockwave that immediately paralyzed the city of Houston was rapidly followed by the cold, clinical, and deeply unforgiving revelations of the county medical examiner. The official autopsy report and the subsequent forensic toxicology screening entirely stripped away the romanticized, highly celebrated aura of the player potion, reducing his tragic demise to a stark, terrifying list of lethal chemical compounds. The medical examiner definitively confirmed that the primary cause of his sudden death was a massive fatal overdose of codeine and promethazine, officially documenting the grim reality that the very prescription cough syrup he had utilized to build his legendary acoustic aesthetic was the exact weapon that terminated his life. However, the comprehensive toxicology results exposed a far more chaotic, deeply disturbing internal landscape than the public had ever realized. His bloodstream was not merely saturated with the purple liquid, it contained a terrifying, highly lethal polysubstance cocktail. The forensic analysis revealed the undeniable active presence of diazepam, globally recognized under the brand name Valium, a powerful, highly addictive benzodiazepine that aggressively compounds the respiratory depression caused by opioids. Even more chillingly, the report documented trace amounts of phencyclidine, the highly volatile, severely dissociative synthetic hallucinogen known as PCP or angel dust. This specific horrifying chemical combination perfectly illustrates the absolute desperate depths of his addiction. He was actively throwing a chaotic, highly dangerous mixture of heavy pharmaceutical sedatives and volatile street narcotics at his central nervous system in a desperate, entirely unmanageable attempt to artificially regulate his crippling exhaustion, his severe anxiety, and his overwhelming creative compulsions. His physical body was simply transformed into a heavily toxic, unregulated chemical dumping ground, entirely incapable of sustaining basic biological functions under the crushing synergistic weight of the multiple depressants. In the agonizing, deeply chaotic vacuum created by his sudden, highly unexpected passing, the fierce loyalty of his localized community rapidly mutated into a dark, pervasive, and heavily paranoid search for an external culprit. The underground streets of Houston fundamentally, absolutely refused to accept the mundane, deeply tragic clinical reality that their highly revered, seemingly invincible king had simply accidentally poisoned himself in a bathroom. The profound collective grief instantly birthed a series of highly persistent, deeply unsettling rumors that aggressively suggested foul play, actively injecting a chilling narrative of targeted corporate assassination and localized extortion into his legacy. Whispers circulated rapidly through the customized car clubs and the independent recording studios, forcefully alleging that Robert had been deliberately, maliciously poisoned by a rival faction. The most persistent, heavy shadows of suspicion were aggressively pointed toward individuals loosely associated with the massive, highly intimidating infrastructure of Rap-A-Lot Records and its notoriously ruthless founder, Jay Prince. The street narrative suggested that the independent, highly lucrative nature of the screwed-up clique had generated severe, dangerous friction with established, powerful entities who aggressively demanded a percentage of his massive, untraceable cash flow, and that a lethal, untraceable adulterant had been secretly slipped into his styrofoam cup as a brutal final act of territorial dominance. These dark, highly conspiratorial allegations threatened to ignite a massive, violent internal conflict within the Texas music scene. However, the individuals closest to his daily operations, the heavily trusted lieutenants of his inner circle, including prominent figures like Mike D., stepped forward to vehemently, publicly, entirely deny the extortion and murder narratives. They explicitly stated that Robert was universally loved, deeply respected by all factions, and completely untouched by the standard violent territorial disputes that frequently plagued the regional rap industry. They heartbreakingly confirmed the simple, unvarnished truth: the enemy was not a rival record executive holding a firearm. The enemy was the liquid sitting in plain sight on the mixing console. Despite these definitive insider denials, the deep psychological scar of his sudden death remains heavily sensitive. The lingering paranoid suspicion that someone, somewhere, had deliberately tainted the syrup continues to quietly haunt the older generation of his fan base, an entirely unresolved, bitter psychological defense mechanism designed to avoid confronting the terrifying reality of his severe, self-inflicted chemical destruction. The devastating biological conclusion of his life absolutely did not halt the massive, relentless momentum of his artistic creation. Rather, his physical absence acted as a massive, explosive catalyst that permanently launched his highly localized cultural movement onto the global stage. In the years immediately following his tragic death in the year 2000, the city of Houston experienced an unprecedented, massive cultural renaissance, heavily dominating the national Billboard charts and dictating the aesthetic direction of the entire mainstream music industry. The specific, deeply sluggish, heavily distorted sonic architecture that he had meticulously engineered in total isolation inside his bedroom was rapidly co-opted, highly polished, and aggressively distributed by multinational corporate record labels. The sheer mechanical brutality of his original process exposes a chilling technological disparity in modern audio production. Robert Earl Davis Jr. literally bled over physical analog equipment, forcefully dragging heavy metal platters and manually splicing magnetic tape in a grueling physical routine that shattered his joints and directly fueled his lethal chemical reliance. Today, the multi-billion-dollar music industry replicates his exact, agonizing biological frequency using entirely sterile, one-click digital software plugins. Modern producers simply slide a digital pitch fader on a brightly lit laptop screen to instantly achieve the heavy, suffocating sounds that literally cost Robert his life. The corporate machinery did not just steal his local aesthetic, they completely digitized his physical suffering, efficiently transforming a man's lethal exhaustion and terminal addiction into a standard, effortless preset downloaded by millions. The unique regional terminology he popularized, the heavy candy-painted car culture he soundtracked, and the distinct dragging audio techniques he invented became the absolute mandatory standard for mainstream commercial success. The sheer, undeniable magnitude of his historical influence eventually forced the highest echelons of standard political authority to formally acknowledge his existence. In a profound, deeply surreal institutional validation that occurred far too late for him to personally witness, Texas Governor Rick Perry officially and publicly recognized Robert Earl Davis Jr. as an official Texas music pioneer. The man who had spent his entire adult life operating entirely outside the boundaries of polite society, selling unlabeled cassette tapes directly out of a residential house, was officially, posthumously inducted into the formal, highly guarded historical registry of the state, firmly cementing his name alongside the most prestigious, globally recognized architects of American music. However, this massive historic posthumous glorification carries a deeply terrifying, profoundly devastating curse that has ruthlessly, systematically decimated the very cultural lineage he established. The brilliant genre-defining aesthetic of chopped and screwed music became permanently, inextricably, and lethally intertwined with the specific pharmaceutical narcotic that heavily fueled its creation. The purple liquid did not vanish from the culture after it stopped the heart of its most famous pioneer. Instead, it rapidly metastasized, transforming into a highly sought-after, highly destructive global status symbol. The exact same severe, heavily romanticized chemical dependency that systematically destroyed Robert's internal organs subsequently claimed the lives of his absolute closest friends, his most dedicated collaborators, and his most prominent musical descendants. The catastrophic, unbroken chain of chemical casualties within the Southern hip-hop community is staggering in its absolute brutality. Big Mo, one of the most prominent, highly successful original members of the Screwed Up Clique, who heavily dedicated his entire commercial discography to celebrating the purple syrup, suffered a massive, fatal heart attack at the age of 33. Pimp C, the legendary, fiercely outspoken architect of the Underground Kings, and a massive, highly influential proponent of the Texas aesthetic, was tragically discovered entirely unresponsive in an upscale hotel room in California. His death officially ruled an accidental overdose, heavily involving the exact same combination of promethazine and codeine. This lethal, highly specific cultural curse entirely refused to remain confined to the geographical boundaries of Texas or the specific era of the early 2000s. The heavy, sluggish aesthetic and the heavily marketed consumption of the prescription syrup violently infected entirely new, younger generations of global artists who deeply revered his original mixtapes. More than a decade after his death, the highly influential visionary founder of the massive New York collective AAAP mob, universally known as AAPMs, suffered a fatal, highly publicized biological collapse directly attributed to acute mixed drug intoxication, heavily featuring the lethal presence of the opioid syrup. The terrifying, undeniable reality is that Robert Earl Davis Jr. completely revolutionized the acoustic foundation of modern music, but the highly specific, chemically dependent lifestyle he inadvertently, heavily promoted became an absolute, highly efficient biological executioner. He constructed a massive, beautiful, and highly lucrative cultural mansion, but he tragically, permanently poisoned the foundational well water that sustained everyone living inside it. The unvarnished, heavily documented historical narrative of DJ Screw stands as one of the most profound, deeply agonizing paradoxes in the entire history of modern commercial art. He was a man endowed with an absolute, undeniable genius, a rare, highly sensitive individual who possessed the unprecedented, almost supernatural ability to physically manipulate the passage of time through a pair of turntables. He generously, selflessly handed the keys to massive financial independence to dozens of impoverished young men in his neighborhood, asking for absolutely nothing in return other than their loyalty and their vocal presence on his tapes. Yet, the absolute grueling demands of maintaining that independent empire, combined with the crushing unspoken psychological weight of being the sole provider for an entire cultural movement, drove him directly into the cold, unforgiving embrace of a severe chemical dependency. The millions of dollars in physical cash he generated, the absolute fierce adoration of his localized community, and his unmatched legendary status as a regional pioneer were entirely, completely powerless to reverse the catastrophic mechanical failure of his own respiratory system. He was the undisputed, highly revered master of the slowdown, a man who built a massive global legacy by forcing the entire world to listen to the heavy, drawn-out spaces between the beats. But in his desperate, highly medicated pursuit of total acoustic perfection, he tragically, permanently lost control of his own biological clock. The ultimate devastating lesson carved into the heavy vinyl grooves of his legacy is a stark, highly clinical warning about the absolute, terrifying cost of pioneering a lifestyle that demands the continuous, unregulated sacrifice of the human body. He fundamentally, irrevocably changed the face of hip-hop forever, but he paid the ultimate, non-negotiable retail price for his innovation, quietly suffocating on a cold bathroom floor, entirely consumed by the very liquid narcotic that originally unlocked his genius, leaving behind a massive echoing silence that the music industry has been desperately, unsuccessfully attempting to fill for over 2 decades.